Hey wallet enthusiasts and adventure seekers, are you ready for a thrilling ride? You probably all know the sponsor of today's video, Ridge, the wallet that's revving up the game. Have you ever thought about upgrading to a Ridge wallet? Well, now's the perfect time, and guess what? Ridge and Hennessy are back with an electrifying summer sweepstakes. Imagine your wallet transforming into a Hennessy Bronco Velociraptor, the off-road beast. It's not just a dream car anymore, it's a chance to grab one right now. Hop onto Ridge's website for a shot at winning a Hennessy Ford Bronco or $75,000 cash. Zero spending required, and you can get one bonus entry for every $1 you spend on the site. And custom Hennessy products come with up to 1,000 entries. Shopping Ridge gets you closer to winning, and with my link provided down below, you can snag 10 bonus entries at checkout. And don't forget to use code Let's Read for 10% off at checkout as well. But Ridge isn't just about winning big. Their wallets hold up to 12 cards and cash while staying sleek. Plus, with RFID blocking, your info stays safe. Lost wallet? Never again with optional AirTag attachments. And key case enthusiasts can rejoice as well, because you can securely carry 1 to 6 keys and enjoy up to 30% off when bundling with a Ridge wallet at checkout. And with over 80,000 5-star reviews, Ridge is trusted and adored. I swear by them. Myself and all my friends have one, and they're so sure that you'll love it too. They offer a 99-day test drive and a lifetime warranty. So elevate your style with Ridge, where fashion meets function. And don't miss Ridge and Hennessy's summer sweepstakes for a chance to win a Bronco Velociraptor when you use my link in the description or pinned comment down below and use code Let's Read at checkout. If you've ever been considering getting a Ridge, now is the best time. I was conducting a recovery dive in a local lake for the police, recovering the body of some idiotic kid who hadn't worn his life jacket while drinking on a party boat. The lake was deep enough to require mixed gas to avoid narcosis. I followed all the normal protocols, keeping in contact with my diving partner and monitoring my dive computer. It doesn't take long to reach the bottom, but getting back up always takes much longer. My partner and I split up to cover more ground due to the extremely low visibility. It must have been about 5 minutes before I saw it. A human silhouette standing upright at the lake's bottom. I swam closer and found him perfectly preserved, without a sign of decay on his body. He was buried in silt up to his shins. It really looked like it could still be alive or had only been dropped into the water a few moments ago. I tied a line to him and started to head back up toward the surface so I could signal the boat to haul up the body. I swam up, letting the line play out behind me until I reached my first safety stop. While I was waiting for my body to decompress further, I noticed that the spool of the line was still being pulled out even though I had stopped. It was completely taut and unspooling at a blistering speed. It took me about half a second to realize that my reel was about to run out, and I was about to be pulled down by the line. There was a good 900 plus feet on my line, and the speed at which it was being reeled out was so tremendous that as soon as I grabbed it, my hand was split almost completely open to the bone. In retrospect, that was a foolish thing to do, but it was just basic instinct to grab the rope and try to cut it with my knife. I then had a sudden burst of clarity and cut the straps holding the reel to my suit after a few seconds before the line ran out, causing it to vanish into the murky water. Within about half a second, I felt as if though the force of the whiplash alone would have been strong enough to break my back and kill me if I hadn't cut the straps. I was pretty shaken at this point, more shaken than I had been since I'd found my first dead kid. Nevertheless, I managed to ascend slowly and take my safety stops despite the pain, fear, and, of course, all the blood leaking out of my hand. It's a good thing this was a freshwater dive, or I might have been in real trouble on my way up. Anyway, my knee-jerk reaction, and what everyone else told me, was that it was narcosis-fueled hallucinations. Divers see all sorts of crazy things when narcosis kicks in. I've heard stories of fish and squid with human faces. Some guy swears that he was face to face with Cthulhu. My point is that narcosis is, to an extent, like temporarily being on DMT, and it can make you see some absolutely insane things. The only thing I could make sense of was how I got the cut on my hand. It's clearly from a rope. It's not clean enough to be from my knife or any other sharp object. The doctor even noticed that I had friction burns all surrounding the cut. So what the heck caused the cut, if I was hallucinating? And if I wasn't hallucinating, what the heck dragged out a line that fast? What really keeps me up at night is that the guy was resting on the bottom of the lake, and my line was going straight down. So either he was pulled through the bottom of the lake, or something with incredible strength and speed grabbed my rope and was reeling me in like a fish. I'm not sure which scenario is worse. I'm a professional diver, and I posted a story of mine a couple of weeks ago or so. I'm not going to write it up again, but to give you the gist of it, I was doing body recovery on a contract for local law enforcement. I found a body, attached a line, and started swimming to the surface when something grabbed the body and started dragging it at an incredible speed. I cut the line just in time to prevent myself from being yanked down with it. I'm sure some of you deep-sea loving individuals will remember that story. I've got a couple of other stories of my own that I can go into more depth if you guys want, mostly involving fish that were a bit too big for comfort coming to take a look while I was doing some welding, or that time my rebreather malfunctioned and I started having a full-blown drug trip while I was 200 meters underwater. Fun stuff. I've got a ton more interesting stories, though, mostly from other divers. I can't speak to the truth of them because I wasn't there, and some are pretty out there. Keep in mind, some of these stories are sort of like diver urban legends. They get passed around until nobody can remember where they started. And the story I'm about to tell you, though, I heard from a good friend of mine, a dive master who trained me on my first dives. I have no reason to believe that he's lying. This was back sometime in the late 80s, I believe. My friend, Frank, had just gotten out of the Navy and started doing civilian work, mostly welding. He worked with the police for a short time, like I did. Like me, for Frank, diving was both a hobby and a job, so he would spend his weekends exploring known shipwrecks and points of interest known to the local diving community. Sometimes he would just set anchor in a random spot and dive down to see what he could find. He usually found a whole lot of nothing, but on this particular occasion, he hit the jackpot. Metaphorically speaking, because there was nothing good about what he found. He was doing an extreme depth dive that day, which, as I explained in my last post, I'm not going to name the lake that he was diving in just in case it somehow leads back to him, but it was a very large lake that was 900 plus feet deep, so he was pushing the boundaries a bit, especially since he was solo diving without any partners. He got to the bottom, and, as per usual, there was just the usual sand, silt, and some rocks covered with algae. Not even any fish that he could see. He dug around in the sand a bit to see if he could find anything, and he felt something hard and smooth buried a few inches under the surface. Frank grabbed it and tried to take a closer look at it, away from the floating sand. It was some sort of prescription bottle with a label worn or torn off. So he put it off to the side and kept digging. He found something much bigger right away. He pulled it out of the sand, and to his shock, he was staring at a human skull. He dug around in the sand some more to find the bones, pretty much feeling his way around because the fine sediments that he was digging up made his visibility almost zero. He found something else hard and pulled it out, but it wasn't another bone. It was another skull. He kept digging and estimated that he found at least 200, likely more, skeletal remains at the bottom. Mixed with the skeletons were, he estimated, thousands upon thousands of prescription bottles like the one he found earlier. He didn't have enough oxygen or time to stay down for long, so he dug around in a few spots to see how large the dump of bodies and bottles were. He estimated that it could have been almost 50 by 50 feet roughly in size, so it's possible that there could have been many, many more bodies there than his estimate. Probably the spookiest bit is that since he had done work with the police, he knew what a body looks like underwater at various stages of decomposition. The bones had been picked clean by fish, but the bones themselves couldn't have been there for much longer than 5 years. Being a good citizen, Frank carried one of the skull pieces up with him to the surface. He talked to some of the people he'd worked with in the police as a diver, and they immediately told him that they were not going to investigate that and that he should never speak about that again. Being someone who valued his own safety, Frank did just that and ended up moving to the other side of the country about a year later. He never told me why, but I've got the feeling that he no longer felt safe working or living in that area. Okay, time for one of my own shorter stories. Frank has more interesting stories than me, but I want to share some stuff from my own personal experiences as well, and this actually happened just last year. I was doing some maintenance and repair work on a dam for an artificial lake. I had chosen the spot to work in particular because it was a treasure trove for exploration as a diver. Since the lake was artificial, there were several small villages, farms, and homes that had been submerged when it was constructed, something that's surprisingly common when it comes to artificial lakes. So I was down at the bottom of the dam, doing a visual inspection of the gate guides and seal plates, trying to find anything that needed maintenance or replacement. It was summer, so the water was pretty murky and visibility was low. Something bumped or nudged me on the back, and I turned around expecting to see my dive partner, but instead, I was staring right at the face of the biggest, ugliest catfish I've ever seen. Water does weird things to your perception of size, but I could swear this thing must have been the size of a small SUV. If it had wanted to, it could have eaten me no problem. I froze in place because I hadn't expected to be in danger from aquatic wildlife on a freshwater dive, but it swam away and circled around for a while as I worked. It's actually fairly common for a fish to watch you while you work, but I've never seen one as big as this before, and I'm just glad that it wasn't hungry. Now, the next story is a bit out there, so to speak. I trust Frank, but being deep underwater can do strange things to the human mind. Narcosis can and does cause hallucinations among other mental disruptions. I've experienced it myself firsthand. When it's happening, your brain can't distinguish reality from the hallucination, and there's never a point in your mind where you go, "Oh, I'm hallucinating." It's usually a case of the frog boiling, where it comes on you slowly. Now, anyway, back to the story. This was probably in the late 90s to early 2000s. Frank wasn't really clear on the date when he told me the story. Frank, at this point, had graduated from casual recreational exploration to full-blown treasure hunting. He had a boat with sonar designed to find shipwrecks and all sorts of neat stuff. To this day, he hasn't found anything of actual value, but I suppose the thrill of the chase is a treasure of its own. It was a long week, and Frank was making a big expedition to a remote part of the coastline where an old ship apparently sunk in the early colonial period. Nobody ever found the wreck. The route was known, but there was a storm and they never arrived. The location was extremely remote. You either got there by boat, almost a 2-day trip from the nearest suitable launch, or you hiked there on foot. Frank figured that the remoteness of the area accounted for the wreck never being found, which is why he was so keen to search himself. He still talks to me about going back there today, since he now has a portable sonar system that you can mount on a canoe. He didn't have one of those back then, so he just packed a bunch of food and supplies for the weekend along with his diving gear. I doubt you could even carry a canoe with you on that hike, but if anyone could, it would be Frank. He gets to the ocean, sets up camp a ways from the ocean in a sheltered nook, then drags his gear down to the ocean and goes for a dive. The first day, he just snorkels mostly. The second day, after he has the lay of the land, his words not mine, Frank decided to go diving. He only had 2 cylinders of air with him from the hike, so he had to make his time count if he wanted to find anything. The entire expedition was ill-advised in my opinion, but Frank does what Frank wants, apparently. He thought he knew exactly where the wreck was because he had figured out where the currents were pulling any debris. So, he set out for that spot, swam in, and dived. Frank gets to the bottom and, to his disappointment, does not find a shipwreck or sunken treasure or anything really of interest. There's a lot of just various debris and rubbish. Even just when he's about to give up, he hears the telltale sound of a boat motor coming from the surface. His immediate instinct is to surface and say hi, but his instincts were screaming something else, so he decided to wait and see until he ran out of oxygen and had to resurface. He swims up a bit closer to the surface to see if he can find a boat following the sound. He sees a boat coming above him and cut off the engines, and something big gets tossed into the water and begins to sink like a rock. Frank said that it was immediately obvious to him what it was based on the silhouette, but he didn't fully realize until the man sank past him, eyes bulging with shock, screaming with empty lungs. Frank followed him to the bottom as fast as he could, and when he got there, the guy was still unconscious, but just barely. He pulled off his rebreather and fitted it over the guy's face while trying to free his legs. His legs had been put in buckets full of cement, and Frank alternated breaths on the rebreather for about 15 minutes while desperately trying to break the guy's feet out of the concrete, without any luck. The whole time he thought the guy was trying to talk to him, trying to say something that he couldn't understand. After about 15 minutes, Frank realized that he couldn't get the guy's legs free. If he stayed down any longer, he would run out of air and die himself. He said leaving the guy down there to drown was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. The poor bastard realized Frank was leaving and frantically grabbed him, trying to rip off his rebreather and keep it for himself. Frank ended up kicking him in the face and swimming off without looking back. He eventually resurfaced and reported this to the police, and they found the body about a week later. Apparently, it was a mob-related killing. It actually happens more often than you think. I don't think Frank ever got over what happened. The way he described it, first the pure relief and joy when Frank gave him the rebreather, and the agonized, panicked fear when he realized Frank was leaving him. Being someone who dives for a living, I've had lots of friends who have drowned on the job for various reasons. It's not something you really dwell on a lot, but this man has always stuck with me. What the hell was he thinking in his final moments? It's probably due to my line of work, but I've got a bit of a fascination with death, or rather, the final thoughts right before death. That last final spark before everything gets snuffed out forever. All divers gather round, for I'm back with more stories from my colleagues around the world. Please sit around the campfire and enjoy a good old-fashioned tale. They don't make them like they used to. Have you heard of the raptures of the deep? Few people have. At 30 meters below the surface, water pressure alters the properties of gases within the human body. What was once harmless or vital begins to poison your mind. The deeper the depth, the deadlier the poison becomes. Symptoms include impairment, euphoria, laughter, anxiety, hallucinations, hysteria, terror, and death. Yet we still venture into those depths, risking our lives and minds, delving into a place where the barrier between the mind and reality becomes very thin. Those of us who return can bring with us only memories of a bizarre alien world beneath the waves. These are some of those memories, tales from beyond the depths of madness. My first story of the night is not set in the depths of the ocean, but rather on the surface. This story was told to me by a captain of a ship that I was on for research work. A good Aussie chap who always had a good yarn or story to tell about life at sea. At the beginning of his career on the sea, he was the greenhorn on a commercial deep-sea fishing trawler. They mostly caught black cod, though a lot of other fish got caught in the net and were discarded. He said that the deeper you laid your nets, the stranger things you pulled to the surface would be. Beyond a certain depth, and fish became inedible, their flesh transforming into a pale, gelatinous substance not long after reaching the surface. One night in particular, it seems this crew set their nets too deep. As the nets were raised out of the water, dripping wet and filled with pale, wriggling flesh, it became apparent that something was wrong. The fish were screaming, and the noise was unbearable. Some of the crew ran below deck, and the rest put in earplugs. After some debate, they opened up the net on the deck to examine the fish. The captain swore that when they did, he saw fish with human faces, distorted, corpulent, and distended, unmistakably human, and they were screaming. Pale blobs of flesh with drooping faces, fleshy noses, and black eyes wretchedly screamed in anger, pain, or hate. They were quickly thrown overboard, and the crew fished in shallower waters from that point onward. The next story is one of my own. Those of you who have been in previous threads might recall me talking about this briefly. I was doing a mixed gas dive to the bottom, which was 60 meters deep in this part of the lake. Mostly I was looking for valuables or other odds and ends that ended up at the bottom of the lake. When I was a kid, I took a tooth on a boat trip. I think that was when my fascination with the deep began. My mind fixated on the idea of my tooth sinking to the murky bottom and lying there, lost to the depths forever. I enjoyed finding those things and bringing them back to the surface. It's so rare that you can bring something tangible with you from the deep. On this particular day, I brought back with me something that was intangible yet infinitely more valuable than any treasure. I still had over half my cylinder and was enjoying scanning over the lake floor, sifting through the sediment and whatever odds and ends had ended up there. Out of the blue, I had a powerful intuition that I was being watched. I turned around and saw a man standing there behind me on the ocean floor. He smiled at me broadly and waved his hand. That's when I recognized him in a sort of stunned shock. I was face to face with my dead father on the lake floor, 60 meters below the surface. He pointed to my cylinder and said something, his face wrinkled with concern. Well, he tried to speak, but when he opened his mouth, only bubbles came out, and I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. He pointed again, directly at my oxygen regulator. It slowly dawned on me what was happening. The equipment was malfunctioning, giving me an improper mix of gases that at this depth can result in raptures of the deep narcosis. At this point, I was aware that I was hallucinating. I should have started swimming back up immediately, but I couldn't. I had left so much unsaid to my father. He had died in a boating accident a few years before, and I had never really gotten over it. He was just there one moment and gone the next. I never said goodbye. You have certain regrets when someone dies, things left unsaid. I always mull them over in my mind. I wish I'd said this. Why didn't I tell him that before he died? And I finally had a chance to tell him those things, to have that goodbye, but I couldn't speak because of the stupid rebreather in my mouth. I started to rip off my mask and rebreather so I could talk to him, but he grabbed my hand. I yanked against him and tried to pull off my mask, but he wouldn't let me. Frustrated, I screamed into my mask, bubbles floating up around me in a stream to the surface, and then I felt him pull me into a hug, the kind he used to give me when I was a little kid. And in that instant, I just knew that he understood, that he knew that this was him saying goodbye. When the bubbles cleared, he was gone. I swam back towards the surface, spent a few minutes at my safety stop, and then resurfaced. I know it wasn't real, that it couldn't possibly be real. And besides, I don't even believe in ghosts. I know I didn't really see my father or my father's ghost down there. It was probably a manifestation of my subconscious desire or some nonsense. I'm not a psychologist. But even still, it's hard for me not to want to believe that it was real in some small way, that my mind was more open in that state and he reached out. I'm not sure why. I guess it's just that it felt like he was there. It felt like him. It felt so goddamn much like him. God, I miss him. This is another story from Frank. If you remember him from one of the earlier deep-sea threads I posted in case you weren't in these threads, Frank was my diving instructor, an absolute legend who has been around for a while and seen lots of strange crap. He never told me exactly where or when this took place, which is kind of irrelevant. In any case, he was taking a group of new diver trainees out on a dive for their certification. Usually they start you out in shallow water, and after a few dives, they take you out somewhere deeper. Frank goes out into the ocean to get you used to the sensation of being underwater and being unable to see the bottom, an important thing to get used to if you're a diver. There's lots of places where the shelf becomes a sheer drop-off, potentially hundreds of meters straight down into nothing but abyss. If you're not used to it, just seeing it can induce panic and terror in certain people. The deep does that to certain people. I would recommend not becoming a diver if you have some sort of phobia or fear of deep water. Facing your fears is great and all, but having a panic attack while you're 40 meters underwater is a bad idea. Frank said that people who panicked or were scared of deep open water were pretty common. Hell, I got pretty scared my first time, but he says there's another reaction he's only seen once, though he's heard of it from other diving instructors. The only way he could describe it is the call of the deep. They dropped into the water off the boat, and Frank could immediately tell something was off. This kid hung back from the group, staring down into the water. Frank tried to pull him back, but he shook off his arm and started swimming away straight down. Frank waited a second and then started after him. He caught up about 30 meters and grabbed his leg. The kid looked back at him, smiled, and then pushed away and continued going straight down. Frank followed him for a bit and tried to stop him again, but the guy just kept going further and further down. Eventually, Frank had to stop and let him go or risk dying himself. And to this day, Frank said it was the most unnerving thing he's ever seen. What could possibly compel a man to just swim straight down into the ocean? What did he think awaited him down there? The kid's body was never found, and the parents actually tried to sue Frank, but he was exonerated by the testimony of the other trainees who backed up his claims. The police chalked it up to the kid actually wanting to take his own life, but I'm pretty sure there's a long list of better ways to do that. As I said, this isn't an isolated incident. No cause or motivation has ever been determined, and the reason why these people swim to their deaths remains a complete mystery. This story comes from early in my time as a commercial diver on the Hibernia rig. The rig is the biggest in the world and is absolutely massive, basically a small city jutting out of the seafloor. The entire thing is on top of a massive concrete platform settled on the bottom of the ocean, which is also used to store barrels of crude. Even back when I was doing this, safety regulations were very important. Unlike most of my other jobs where I mostly inspected and repaired the integrity of the structures themselves, I was checking the oil storage itself to ensure that it was safe, secure, and not leaking out of containment. It was good, steady work inspecting the site nearly every day, and it paid well. Usually I worked with a group of 2 other divers. The day this happened was like pretty much any other. The weather was terrible, the onboard chef's omelet was delicious, and the rig workers were also terrible. Nothing new, so we began to dive. I reached my target and began inspecting lids, seams, and taking water samples to ensure no minute particle leakage. After a few minutes, I got a weird feeling on the back of my neck that I was being watched. I turned around to see one of my partners floating a distance away from me, watching me work. I waved at him and gave the okay sign to signify that I was okay, and he returned it. I wasn't sure why he was watching me instead of doing his own work, but I didn't really care much. However, I had a feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I mulled it over in my mind while I worked. Something about him seemed off, but I had no idea what it was. So I turned around again after a bit, and sure enough, he was still there watching me. I waved at him and made the same okay hand sign, and again he returned it. Something about the way he did it made me feel disgusted and repulsed. The fingers looked wrong, if that makes any sense. I don't remember enough detail to describe exactly how they moved incorrectly, but I felt a distinct uncanny valley-level repulsion upon seeing it. I was looking at something very, very wrong. My gut instinct was screaming at me that this guy was dangerous, and that's when I realized what had actually been bugging me initially. The guy didn't have any bubbles coming out of his regulator. Oh God, this guy doesn't have a rebreather. My diving partner has a rebreather. This isn't my diving partner. Wait, how can this guy be giving off bubbles without a rebreather? And here's where I need to explain a bit of technical stuff for those not familiar with diving equipment. Regulators are those typical scuba masks you see. You breathe in air from them and exhale into the sea. Rebreathers are much bulkier and they recycle the air you're exhaling, reusing it so that you get more efficiency for longer or deeper dives. Regulators make bubbles and rebreathers don't. As I said, all our guys on the rig used rebreathers. It was company policy and the best option. This diver was using a regulator, and on top of that, he wasn't making any bubbles, which was just screaming all kinds of alarms. I stared at him for a second as he floated there, staring back at me through the gloomy water. My stupid search and rescue/recovery instincts kicked in, and I assumed this diver was having an emergency malfunction with his rebreather and couldn't breathe, possibly already unconscious or dead. So I tried to suppress the blaring warning signs in my gut and swam over to him as quickly as I could. The warning signs in my gut grew worse the closer I got. There was just something about this guy that was wrong somehow. I can't describe it any other way than that I knew instinctually that he should not exist, that he was wrong. Finally, my gut got the better of me just as I reached out to pull off his broken regulator so we could share my rebreather on our way up. I stopped my hand a few inches away from the mask and felt an intense jolt of fear. Staring down into his mask, there was nothing behind it. It was completely empty. No eyes, no face, no skull, no corpse, just blackness. I reached out with my hand and touched the top of his head. His wetsuit hood squished inwards as I pushed, deforming the shape of his head. And that's when it moved. The thing turned its mask up towards my face, raising its hand and making the OK sign again. My body was in full flight or fight mode at this moment, and though I'm no coward, spooky phantom divers are pretty far beyond my limits of what I'm willing to engage with. So I swam away, putting a decent distance between us before I dared look back. When I turned to look, I saw the diver floating backwards into the current, leaking black oil or blood or something from his mask and limbs. It wasn't long before he was entirely hidden behind a black cloud, vanishing into the murky sea. I went back up to the surface as quickly as humanly possible, assuming that I had a bad gas mix or a malfunctioning rebreather causing narcosis. The maintenance crew never found anything wrong with my gear, though. That doesn't rule out the possibilities of narcosis-induced hallucinations. Being in the Navy, you get to see a lot of the world, and with 2 deployments currently under my belt, I have seen a lot of crazy things. However, this occurred during my last deployment, and it's a moment I'll never forget, not just due to the fact that it's left me physically shaken, but there was no explanation to what we saw that night. I had watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, and my watch station is in a little area right behind the bridge. In this area, I was the supervisor of a small team of 4 others, making sure that they did their job properly, which was to make sure that we knew what other ships are out there, who they are, and where they came from. The midnight watch is usually pretty boring, as nothing really happens around that time. The bridge team tend to keep to themselves around that time and only came to bug us when they had questions about a ship or any possible ships in the area. I had one person out on the bridge to talk to the lookouts, which were people stationed around the ship that made visual reports to the bridge on other ships or any marine life that could be near us. To ensure that I knew what the lookouts were reporting, I had a speaker hooked up to the station that the lookouts used to talk to each other and make reports. Usually during this time, the lookouts like to talk about nonsense and gossip amongst each other. I will admit, a lot of their conversations were funny. On this particular night, however, one of the lookouts made a report to the bridge, and I knew something was wrong because she sounded extremely nervous. And here's the initial report. Bridge? Port Fantail? Go ahead, Port Fantail. Bridge, the water behind us is glowing. Say again? I can't explain it any other way, but the water is glowing. What the hell? I said to myself as I went out to the bridge and talked to my guy out there, making sure that he heard what I heard as well. We both reported it to the JOOW, the junior officer of the watch, and he thought it was weird as well, but claimed that it might just be bioluminescent algae, which, although extremely uncommon, It made sense at the time. I told my guy to pass the word back to the lookout in hopes that it would calm her down. As I walked back to my station, I heard the lookouts talking through the speaker, teasing and making fun about her reporting glowing algae. After that, all seemed normal. About 20 minutes later, I heard the lookout come out again, and this time talking to one of the other lookouts. "Starboard fantail? Port fantail?" "Yeah?" "Did you see the water glowing in the distance?" "Yeah, what about it?" "I think it's following us." "You're stupid." "No, seriously, look at it. We passed about 20 minutes ago. We shouldn't be able to see it anymore." "You're either really tired or really paranoid, and you need to calm down." After that, the lookout again reported it to the bridge, and this time, the JOOW told him the password to inform him when the glowing algae got closer. I went outside myself to check it out, and I did indeed see it. Although it could be nothing, I was a bit on edge also. Then, out of nowhere, I visually see the glow rapidly getting closer to the ship, coming in from behind. I ran back inside and heard the lookouts making the report, but before I could inform the bridge, the water around the ship started to glow. The glowing faded slowly, then got brighter every few seconds, and everyone on the bridge was completely dumbfounded. No one moved or spoke, just stood in place, watching as the bridge filled in and out with an ominous green glow. And this went on for a couple of minutes, but felt like an eternity. I don't know what others were thinking, but I honestly thought that this was the end. We then watched as whatever was glowing beneath the ship slowly moved away from us, moving ahead of us. Then, in a sudden flash of light, it was completely gone. Everyone on the bridge remained silent for about a minute, and even though everyone was shaken up, we all tried to get past it, and many went on like it never happened. Since there was no official report of the incidents, and since it was never passed down to the other watches, this event technically never happened except to those who witnessed it, which happens more than you think. The captain was never informed on what had happened. I've not been able to stop thinking about that day, and I haven't told anyone about it, not even my wife and family, not because they won't believe me, but because they worry about me constantly when I'm out at sea, so I kept it to myself until now. I just wanted to share what I experienced and to pass the word that there is something in the ocean. What is it? I don't know. And that truly terrifies me. Last story for now. I'll see if I can dig up some more later. This is from the old guy I talked about earlier, a nice marine biologist who has experience in both deep-sea wells and nature research studies with reefs. Apparently, the carpet ate one of his rafts on an expedition, according to him. It happened late one night while the rest of the crew was sleeping. He was pulling an all-nighter, studying the sea life around volcanic vents. He was moving the raft from one vent area to the next when he saw what he described as churning sediments on the sea floor. A giant moving cloud of underwater dust essentially moving towards the raft. He moved in closer and saw what he described as a colossal ectoderm crawling along the seafloor, with long dexterous filaments probing the seafloor ahead of it. He maneuvered the raft in for a closer look and used the arm to prod one of the filaments. In the blink of an eye, he lost contact with the raft. Apparently, it happened so fast he didn't even see it happen. 1 second, the thing was about 5 meters away from the vehicle, and the next second, it had swallowed the thing whole. His excuse for not having footage was that the footage was all recorded and stored on the raft, rather than being recorded on the operating station, which seems pretty fishy to me. However, he was very confident in himself to the extent that he claims that he is the discoverer of this new species. He gave it a name which I completely forgot because it was so stupid and boring, but giant sea carpet sounds way cooler anyways. And way back in the mid-90s, I read a book on cryptids that there was something called the hide. Apparently, it was a flattish thing with eyes along the rim, about the size of a large cowhide, hence the name. From what I recall, there was one observation of such a creature rising up to an underwater trench to absorb a shark that had somehow become paralyzed by it. It was observed at some distance by a diver. Does any of that ring a bell for anyone? Supposedly it took place somewhere off the Pacific coast of South America. Some people who claim to have seen the thing mentioned other similar things. A lot of the stuff I've heard from other divers seems like it could be attributed to very rare and very large siphonophores that live in the deep sea. Now the following is a response to the previous post. What you're talking about was described to me as a sort of pancake-shaped creature that would hide under the sand with a single small, near-transparent tentacle floating upwards. A diver touched it, spasmed, and immediately the creature rose out of the sand to devour him. Don't touch strange things in the ocean. People may as well go on a tangent and talk about some other stories I've heard that might be attributed to siphonophores. There was this one cranky old retired diver who swore he'd seen a sea monster of unfathomable size on a dive once. I always assumed that he was full of it, but the way he described it sounds a lot like a siphonophore. The story went something like this. He was on a dive doing something that I've forgotten when he saw an absolute giant tentacle stretching up from the nearby drop-off. The thing was so huge that he couldn't see the beginning nor end of it. So now he goes around constantly claiming to have come within a hairbreadth of being devoured by a gargantuan sea leviathan of unfathomable proportion. And yes, that is exactly how he talked. Looking into siphonophores, it makes total sense that something like this could exist, though it would be less of a sea monster and more of a giant serpentine jelly blob sifting through plankton and floating nutrients. Another siphonophore-related story I've heard is about a absolutely gargantuan jellyfish-type creature that was allegedly about the size of a military submarine. The diver who saw it said the thing was so massive that it had somehow developed its own biosphere, with various species of fish circling around and swimming inside it. He described it as having an appearance like a giant upside-down orchid suspended underneath a massive sphere of translucent jelly. The coloration was very dull, but that might have just been due to the extreme depth. This story is a bit out there in terms of believability. It's not a very widely spread or widely believed story, mostly because of how crazy and supernatural it is. If you work as a diver for long enough, you're bound to run into a few people like this. Ultra-superstitious guys who believe in all sorts of curses, bad luck, sea monsters, etc. A common belief you'll find among many of them is this sea deity, god, or demon called Davy Jones, who roams the seafloor searching for divers or sailors who have displeased him for one reason or another. Whether something or someone is lost at sea and never recovered, Davy Jones has got it. What makes this story interesting is the description one guy gave me of this Davy Jones, because it's pretty spooky. The guy claimed to have seen on one of his dives a trail of giant footprints approximately as long in length as he was tall, so about 5.5 feet long since the guy was pretty short, and though he'd never seen it himself, he claimed that one of his friends had. This Davy Jones was a bipedal humanoid that stood over 200 feet tall, had stalk-like limbs, walking along the seafloor and kicking up great clouds of silt behind him as he walked. According to this guy, looking into the face of this creature meant instant death for his village. It would be too terrifying for any mere human to behold. This story comes from an intrepid treasure hunter who I'll call Carl. Carl was a week into his 2-week treasure hunting voyage/vacation, and so far he had little success, and today wasn't any better. It was nearing lunchtime, and all he'd done was sit around, drinking beer and watching a sonar. Finally, he spotted something that piqued his interest, a pole-shaped object jutting out of the ocean floor and propped against a large rock outcrop. More often than not, Carl mentioned objects like this on sonar ended up just being old waterlogged trees that had sunk to the bottom. However, there was always a chance that it was the mast of a long, sunken ship shattered by undersea currents, with its treasures and artifacts spread across the sea floor. Hoping for a much-needed win, Carl prepared his gear and dove. The descent was uneventful, visibility was good, and he could spot the object from a distance. As he got closer, his excitement grew and he became more convinced that it was a wreck. Finally reaching the spot, he discovered that the beam was in fact jutting out of the rock rather than leaning against it. The rock was weathered and covered by dead coral and barnacles along with the mast. The shape was distinctly similar to the hull of a large ship. An intact hull meant intact treasure, and Carl eagerly began to search for an entry point to investigate the interior. After a few minutes of searching, he couldn't find a single hole or break in the coral-encrusted exterior of the wreck, which was a bit odd given that the ship had sunk. Carl almost gave up hope until he came across something extremely strange, a perfectly preserved door embedded in the side of the hull. Carl's first instinct was to open it, but out of nowhere, every single one of his instincts started screaming alarm bells at him. He hadn't seen a single fish or sign of life on or near the wreck. The wreck was old, too old for there to be a perfectly preserved modern door complete with an uncorroded brass handle in the side of the hull. He pulled back and took another closer look at the wreck as a heavy sense of dread began to overtake him. He found a patch of the mast where the coral crust had fallen away, revealing the true surface. After knocking on it a few times, Carl realized that the mast wasn't made of wood, it was stone. If the entire wreck was petrified, it was very, very old, much too old to make any sense, and much, much too old for there to be a completely preserved modern door in the side of the hull. Who the hell puts a door in the side of their ship anyways? The sense of dread Carl was fearing became overpowering. Every single one of his senses was screaming at him that he shouldn't be there, that he didn't belong, that something was very, very wrong. But there was no way that he could just come all the way out here, make the discovery of a lifetime, and just leave. So he swallowed his fear and headed back towards the door. He wasn't going to let nerves take away what was possibly one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the century. As he swam around the hole to the section containing the door, the fear intensified until, as he described it, it felt like he was having a complete mental breakdown. Still, he pushed through his fear and toward the door. As it came into sight, he noticed something was wrong. The door was ajar and slowly opening from the inside. Carl sat there for what must have been a full few seconds, watching the door open. His entire body screamed at him to run. And that was when he felt something else. Something watching him from inside the door. Something that Carl could only describe as pure, unthinkable evil. Carl made a mad dash for the surface, hyperventilating and screaming into his mask, not daring to look back as he could feel a presence following behind him, watching with hungry eyes. He shot straight to the surface without any safety stops, flopped onto his boat, and headed back towards land at full speed. He managed to call the Coast Guard for help, despite being racked with pain from decompression sickness. He was picked up off of his ship in a helicopter and flown to the nearest decompression chamber, and thanks to the quick rescue, Carl survived, albeit with permanent joint damage and some paralysis in his left leg that put an end to his treasure hunting career. He refused to share the location of the wreck with me, and it seems that some things on the bottom of the ocean aren't meant to be found. So, this is another story from Frank, and it's a fascinating one. During his time as a commercial diver on the West Coast, Frank made an intriguing friend. With friends like this, who needs enemies? Frank first encountered his friend while performing a basic maintenance checkup at the local marina. He was inspecting the moorings to ensure their good condition when he noticed something unusual. One of the mooring chains appeared to be protruding straight out of a large rock on the ocean floor. Curious, Frank approached it to take a closer look, and to his surprise, the chain was somehow embedded in the rock. Perplexed, Frank reached out and realized that the rock felt oddly soft and squishy. And strangely, the rock even seemed to be looking at him. Suddenly, the color of the rock flashed to a pale white, and in an instant, the entire rock vanished in a cloud of dark ink. By now, you might have guessed it. Frank's friend is a Pacific giant octopus. These creatures can weigh around 110 pounds and boast a tentacle-to-tentacle span of over 14 feet in diameter. They possess the remarkable ability to change the color of every cell in their bodies, allowing them to mimic almost any object on the sea floor. They are both sizable and nearly invisible, not to mention highly intelligent. Luckily for Frank, this particular octopus, whom he named Frederick, turned out to be mischievous rather than a dangerous menace like some accounts of giant octopuses suggest. Over the following months, Frank had several encounters with Frederick during various dives. Frederick had a penchant for mimicking peculiar objects, suddenly flashing white upon discovery and then playfully swimming away in a cloud of ink. After a while, Frank simply started assuming that any odd sight he encountered was Frederick's way of playing a prank on him, and he began to ignore such displays. However, this only led Frederick to engage in more creative pranks, like tickling the back of Frank's head while he was looking or toying with the valves on his diving equipment. After a series of such interactions, where Frederick's antics were ignored one time too many, Frederick briefly tampered with Frank's oxygen regulator before restoring it. From then on, Frank made sure to not disregard his friend, and even occasionally brought down toys or objects from the surface for Frederick to play with. This unusual friendship persisted for most of the year, until around January when Frederick vanished for several weeks. Frank admitted relief, but he couldn't help worry about his friend's whereabouts. Eventually, Frank rediscovered Frederick at the same marina where they had first crossed paths. Frederick was coiled around the mooring chain, camouflaged as a rock. However, his disguise wasn't as convincing as before. The rock was conspicuously dotted with white spots. Frank greeted Frederick in his customary way of waving hello, and after a moment's pause, Frederick waved back, briefly flashing white before reverting to a rock-like hue. Frank lingered for a while, but Frederick seemed uninterested in games like hide-and-seek, so Frank returned to his tasks. After about a week of half expecting to spot Frederick on one of his dives, Frank revisited the marina. Frederick was still there, wrapped around the chain. He no longer pretended to be a rock. His skin was now a bright red with molted white spots. He acknowledged Frank with a wave and a flash of white, then reverted to his red hue. Frank had brought fish this time, yet Frederick declined the meal and remained anchored around the mooring. The following day, Frank returned with a lobster, apparently Frederick's favorite food. Still, Frederick clung to the mooring chain and rejected the lobster. He didn't wave or flash white as usual. The subsequent day, Frederick was nowhere to be found, and for the next month, Frank returned to the marina weekly hoping to see Frederick again, but the octopus was conspicuously absent. Eventually, Frank relinquished the hope of encountering his friend at that location. Yet to this day, Frank sometimes inspects peculiar rocks or objects underwater, hoping for one last glimpse of Frederick. At the bottom of the ocean, one can find numerous things, but a friend is rarely among them. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Frank